Hi. So my name is Dalton Mitchell, and I'm here to talk about Vue.js today. I'm a software engineer for a company called Riskalyze. We're up in Northern California in Auburn. And you can find me on the Twitters and GitHub as Dalton A Mitchell or daltonmitchell.com. And also we are hiring. So if you're interested in, we work with a few different JavaScript frameworks, but a lot of JavaScript on the front end and back end, in addition to PHP. So check out riskalyze.com/careers if you are looking for work and interested in Vue.js, React, and other things. Okay, so I'm here to talk about Vue.js. Just by show of hands, how many people are familiar, have maybe played with Vue a little bit, maybe built a whole application? Okay, cool. So we got a few people. How many React fans here? Probably a lot of those. Angular? One or two? Okay. I think you will all kind of find something familiar about Vue.js. Maybe even take some concepts that you can bring back to your framework. But I'm also hoping this will get you curious to kind of step outside your comfort zone. That's how I found out about Vue, and just try something different. I happen to have a situation where I got to just try Vue out a tiny bit at a time, and I found it worked really well for that. From the beginning, but it also continued to scale really well as we built out the application. So you probably know Vue is a JavaScript framework built for web interfaces. It's interesting that Vue is designed kind of from the ground up to be incrementally adoptable. The core library is pretty tiny and focused. I think it's about 19 KB gzipped. But I found it very easy to pick up, and it also integrated really well with other libraries. It was kind of there for me when I needed some guidance and some structure. And then beyond that, I was just writing JavaScript. And I found I got into this habit of not thinking so much how to use the framework, but I thought a lot about what do I want to build in my app? What's the next thing that I need to build? What's the next feature? And Vue was there to provide me a tiny bit of guidance, but I wasn't so focused on the framework. I was really focused on what do I want this app to be? And I found that a really nice experience. So to talk a little bit more about my experience, last year I was working for a company and we had the task to kind of redesign our entire web application in addition to our website. And so we came to this crossroads. We had a big monolith running PHP with just templates and jQuery. And we thought JavaScript would really be nice to improve the experience if we added in a framework like React or something similar. But none of us on the team really had experience with those technologies. And so I had heard about Vue. It's pretty popular in the PHP community as an interface layer. So I decided to try it out. I spent about an hour kind of peeking through the documentation and then tried just some simple kind of hello world things on some very small problems that we had. I think the initial thing I worked with was we had a page that just displayed a list of frequently asked questions that was dynamically changed and updated on the server. And jQuery was handling that, and that was really tough to maintain, really kind of difficult to reason about when you got bugs in there. So I tried to see if I could swap that out with Vue. And it did really well, and I kind of continued to use it from there. So what I'm actually going to take you through today is a similar experience. We're going to build a small Vue.js app, starting from no Webpack, no dependencies or NPM or anything, just kind of what we could do with straight HTML, and then we'll kind of build out from there. And I'm hoping to show that the experience is pretty nice, and Vue is really easy to get started, but it also scales really well. So some of the things I like about Vue, and it seems like This is a common trend throughout the industry, is that Vue is very flexible. Like I said, the core library is very focused. There are some additions. There's a router package that you can include with that, but you don't have to. In fact, in the documentation, they tell you how to write your own router just by kind of building a plain old JavaScript object to kind of handle that logic for you, if that's all you need. It's very lightweight, as mentioned already. It's pretty performant. I'd encourage you to take a look at the docs on Vuejs.org, and there's a nice long section about how Vue compares to other popular frameworks. So if you're used to using React, you can kind of see what the differences and similarities are to React. If you're used to using Angular, you can see those differences as well. And as mentioned again, Vue is really designed to be incrementally adoptable. So you can start with the tiniest amount of it and be pretty productive, but as you find that you need to add more power, it's also a pretty pleasurable experience. So again, just to reiterate what this talk is about, this is about my personal first experience with Vue over about a 4-month period last year. And kind of why I like it, why I continue to use it, even though I'm now working with React and Backbone and some other technologies, in addition to having a background with Ember. But I want to kind of set up expectations. This talk is not about everything you need to know about Vue.js. That would be pretty tough, and I wouldn't consider myself an expert. I'm a fan, and I've learned enough that I can be pretty productive. But if you are interested in learning more, I would definitely encourage you to head over to Vuejs.org and kind of read through the docs. They're really well written, and I feel like the documentation is really good, and that helps. But if you really want to dig in deeper, that's the place to go. Okay, so let's build an app. And in the process of building this app, we're going to kind of consider 3 different pieces of the Vue ecosystem. There's the Vue instance itself, which is just kind of the core, it's the root of all Vue applications. We're going to consider a Vue component, and that'll be pretty familiar for those used to working with React and kind of component-based architecture. And then we'll also consider this thing called a single file component. Sort of like a React component with JSX, maybe sprinkled with some CSS in there as well. But you'll find that what I like about it is that it's not JSX, it's just HTML in the same file with your JavaScript for the component and CSS all in the same file. And I found that that was a little weird to get used to in the beginning, but it began to be really productive when I could kind of focus on the concerns of a particular component. And that included the JavaScript, the styling, the markup structure, and everything all together. Okay, so let's start with the Vue instance. Like I said, the Vue instance is the root of all Vue.js applications. It really is just an object, basically, that provides us with a declarative way to render some data to the DOM and kind of tie that data to a template. So let's take a look at one. This is what a basic Vue instance looks like. You can see we have our HTML, which has a templating syntax that's probably familiar to most of you if you used any JavaScript framework, but that's just written right in the HTML. The way that works is that we're binding to that div with an ID of application. So you'll see in the object down below, we instantiate a new Vue object. We pass it in some options. In this case, we want to tell it your root should be an element with an ID of app. And that data property is actually where we're going to put all our data that's going to be available in the template. So we have to explicitly specify what data is going to be in there. We can have side effects and things like that, but we need to be kind of explicit about where they're going to be and what they're going to be used for. So here we've got a kind of another breakdown of what all that was. That this is basically the core of a Vue instance. You bind to some root element, and then Vue has access to the data and rendering DOM and kind of managing that data beneath that. So to get a little further into that data property, that data is going to contain all of our static properties that will be available to the template. We'll see a little later some syntax for allowing the user to interact with pieces of that data. And that data is reactive, so it is possible to change it, but we need to be explicit about what data is going to be available in the template ahead of time. So we'll go into our next kind of useful property on the Vue instance. And again, I'm not going to cover all the properties. I'm really covering the ones that I found to be most useful. And I found that they kind of carried throughout, and anytime I was working with anything in Vue, I found myself using these properties. So computer properties are also where we specify data that's going to be available in our template. The difference is computed properties, as the name might imply, are computed based on the value of some other properties. So they could be based on the value of another computed property. They are usually based on the value of something in our data object or a property that we pass in when we get a little further into components. And it really kind of allows us a nice way to, when we have a base set of values, but we know those values are going to change over time, and we really kind of want to be explicit about how they change and what happens with the data as it changes, computed properties are really nice for that. So we can see here the example that gets used a lot in documentation is you want to calculate a user's first name, but your data, or you want to calculate a user's full name, but your data is a set of a first name and a last name or something similar. We don't really want to mutate those properties directly because that can get tough to debug, and there's lots of reasons why we might want to take a different route with that. So we use a computed property to just say, look at the current value of those and output this data based on what that value is. And if it changes, recalculate your value and give us a new full name value. Another nice thing about computed properties is that Vue caches their values. So if you have instances where you might be triggering change events on the dependent values, Vue's actually going to look and see, did that value actually change? And only in cases where the value is actually something different, then Vue will go ahead and do the work of recomputing a new property. So methods is another useful property. Methods basically allow us to specify functions that we want to have access to in our template. So we can see here, we want to fire off a function called say hello when the user clicks on this button. Not the greatest example, but it kind of simplifies the point of how you would use a method. So it allows us to pass in a value from the template, but this method really is just kind of it's a static function. And so we're going to pass in a value and do something based on whatever that value currently is. So we're passing in a name and then we're saying hello to that. Methods are a really good place if you need to kind of do some work, maybe a side effect, something like that, but it's not necessarily based on a value. It's more based on user interaction. Methods are a really good spot to place those. Sort of similar, I feel like they're a mix between your methods and your computed properties. Watchers react to values that change on your Vue instance, but instead of outputting a new value, they're basically a method that fires when a data value changes. So we can see here that if you look in the template, we've got an input, and there's that thing that says vModel. What that's saying is we want, the user is going to be able to change that value. So when they type into that input, vModel is going to look at what the value property of that input element is. And when that changes, it will change the name property on our data object. So that's what that vModel equals name is doing. And so if you look down in the watch, we're saying watch the value of name. And when name changes, it'll get a new name and it'll do something with that new value. Here, it's a trivial example, so we're just console logging something, but that can be pretty powerful when you happen to be in those cases where you need it. So you may be noticing a trend here that Vue is really just an object with a set of properties that each kind of have their own purpose. And this is what I really liked about working with Vue, is that I learned what each of those properties were, what their purpose was, and then I got back to thinking about application logic. And as I would get to a feature that I needed to build or refactor, I would think, okay, what is the behavior that I need? What is the data that the user needs to see? What does the application need to do at this point? And then I would just kind of go to the toolbox that Vue provided me, and I'd use the appropriate tool. And I found that to be really productive because I didn't spend a whole lot of time up front thinking about how am I going to do this in Vue. I would just build things and then think about what I needed to build next, and then build something else, and then think about what I needed to build next. And it was almost as if, even while building production features, I was prototyping, because I could move really quickly and try things out, and never really get too far before I needed to think about what I needed to do next. And that was really nice to kind of have a framework give me that encouragement, to think a little bit more about what I was going to do before I did it. So let's get into actually building something. What we're going to build is just a simple Hacker News clone. Just by show of hands, I realize I don't have a good before example of what Hacker News looks like. Do you all know pretty well what Hacker News is? It's basically a link sharing site where you can share links to different technical articles and things like that. People can upvote them, and you can see the newest, the latest. You can make comments and things like that. We're going to build a really simplified example using Vue, and we're going to use the least amount of Vue possible until we need to do more. And you'll kind of see the experience I went through when I first tried Vue myself. So this is a very trivial example of how we would actually render a list of links for a Hacker News like site. I know that's kind of tiny, but we're going to dig into each of those pieces a little further, so don't worry about squinting too much. We'll kind of expand those a little bit in a sec. But basically, just like we saw before with the Vue instance, we're binding to that root element of app. We have an unordered list, and then you'll see that li has that kind of v-4 syntax that might be familiar if you use Angular and you're used to directives. Basically, what we're saying is for every post in an array value of post, build out this list item tag and the children of whatever we're going to put in that element. In this case, we're printing out the text of the description of the link and then the actual URL. And we're just including Vue in the head tag from the CDN because that's really all we need at this point. And then a script tag below which defines our post array and the Vue instance just like we did before. Nothing really special here. So to kind of expand this a little bit, this is what our data structure for posts looks like right now. This could be similar to something that maybe we have set up as an API that we're kind of building in tandem with the front end. For right now, it was just easier to inline the data. Also, I don't need to worry about conference internet and things like that. So, but yeah, basically just an array of objects with a description and URL. So to dig into that Vue instance a little further, again, you can see that we're just including Vue right in the the head tag there, nothing special. We are naming our post value, and then we're saying in the data property, we've only got one value, post, and we want that to be available in the template. And then again, to kind of drill into the template a little further, we're binding to that root element of app, and in our unordered list, for every object in that post value, again, we're going to print out a list item, and that is going to have some child text properties that contain the description and the URL. And so here we took the added step of actually adding some navigation. Pretty simple, just a few links for all the new posts and the submit. Today we're only going to deal with the new post and just rendering that for simplicity's sake. But basically you would follow the same process to build out new features, because once you get the basics of Vue, really things don't change much. But you will notice also that I have added the kind of a numeric value to specify, because we can rate posts and we can upvote them, we want to specify what order they're in. So first, second, third, that type of thing. And then just some simple basic styling to get this to actually look like Hacker News. And then we'll kind of see here, oh, that is really tiny. But if you squint enough, that looks like pretty close to Hacker News with that sample data that we had before. And later on, I'm going to actually show this live, so you'll be able to peek at it a little more. So let's add the ability to upvote our posts. So we'll start by adding some actual vote totals to our data. We're just going to count numeric values on those for now. This could be stored in a database, and there's many ways that we could get to a data structure that looks like this, but this is what the data looks like at this point. And so to display the votes, all we've added here is, if you look at that last div, that's just printing out our votes because we've added that data property, and we've added the little triangle character as our button to be able to actually do the upvoting. And so we'll see back in our Vue instance, we have added a computed property now. And I didn't actually point that out, but you'll see in our v4 post index in post, we are going to get to the point where we need to sort those posts, because we need to actually sort by their rating value. So sorted post is a computed property that's going to look at posts every time post changes. So we get a new post in or we update a value, it's just going to compare and sort those in descending order by the number of votes. So now we'll see we're in our template, we've actually updated it. And really the only change we needed to make here was that instead of v4 post in post, now it's v4 post in sorted post. And because that computed property is kind of watching that for us, we really didn't have to change anything other than that in our template. And so on the tiny example there, you can see, you can barely see it, but underneath you can see how many votes each post has, and they are sorted from greatest to least. So going further, we want to actually enable you to click on the button and be able to upvote a post. And we're just going to allow you to upvote as much as possible for simplicity, but you could, I'm hoping you'll be able to easily see how you can add in the option to, if you have authentication, to only enable a user to upvote a post one time. So what has changed is we have added an ID to each of the pieces of data in our post objects. And that's just so when we click on a post and upvote it, we'll know which post we actually clicked on. So that's pretty standard. So we will update our template. A couple things have changed here. We are in our v4 directive. Just after that, we have this vbind key equals post.id. If you're used to working with React, you'll be familiar with what the key property does. It just allows Vue to watch those objects and actually know what changed if, say, your array gets mutated and things like that. It'll actually be able to keep track of everything. And you'll get warnings in the console if you don't do that. It's not required, but it's a best practice, and the console will warn you using the development versions if you don't specify a key for looping over an array structure. And so, other than that, we have added a v-on-click equals upvote. And so we're saying, whenever you click on this button, run this function called upvote and give it the post ID. And we'll see what that connects to in a second. Just wanted to show you here the alternative to the vbind and v-on syntaxes. For vbind, you can just use colons. So colon key is the same as saying v-bind colon key. And if you see that at click there, that's the same as saying v-on click, run this function. So back in our Vue instance, we'll see we've added a method, upvote. That's what's actually going to fire when we click on that button. Upvote's going to take in an ID, it's going to find which post actually corresponds to that ID, and just increment the counter. Still, we're not doing anything really too crazy here. This is just kind of what we do a lot in JavaScript already. So not a lot of whole new concepts here. And I kind of like that about Vue, that things stay pretty consistent. So I hope you guys can see this a little better. This is the actual functionality at this point, that we should be able to click on those buttons and they will actually sort and update. So we'll kind of go on to Vue Components. Vue Components kind of, as the application scales, you don't really want to write all your logic in that one Vue instance. So Vue Components allow you to split up logic, state, and in a really maintainable way that's easy to reason about. But they're actually very simple to Vue instances. So you pretty much know most of what you need to write a Vue component. So there's our Vue instance again, where we would do new Vue and bind to an element. Vue component, we would do Vue.component, pass in a name for that component, and then you'll see that name is actually what we're going to use in the DOM to render that component. And then we pass an option similar to the Vue instance. It's important to remember that you need to register that component before you actually register the Vue instance so that it'll know about it. But here you can see where we got a root Vue instance and we're able to render that component underneath. And so Vue components differ from the Vue instance in that they don't bind to a DOM element because you're creating the DOM element, but what they do take is a template, which returns some string representation of a DOM structure. And what we'll see later is we can extend that even further to single file components, which are really nice. And that's what our structure would be rendered. So we would go from what we see here, and here's what would actually be rendered in the DOM. So we can kind of see here a Vue component with the data property, and it looks pretty similar to our Vue instance. So again, things don't really change. You kind of learn those core concepts once, and they continue to go through the same and not change much. One thing we will see here is that it looks like I did not actually I didn't write that example correctly, but the difference in the data property on a Vue component is that data must be a function. So it's a factory function that actually would return this object. So yeah, if that confuses some people and you're like, that's not right, that should be a function that would return that object. Whereas in a Vue instance, you would just return the object. So here we'll see that in components, we can nest other components. Here we are building a child component with a message property, and that my message is actually going to be passed in from our parent. So we can have properties passed down to children components, but they have to be explicitly specified like we see here. And we can also add some validation to our components. So rather than just specifying that we have a myMessage property, we can also say that my message is going to be a string. If it's not a string, give me a console error to help you with the validation there. And we can even go further to specify the type, whether it's required or not, and give it a default value. So let's refactor our app so far to use this new component syntax. So what we see here is I've extracted all the information that was in that navigation section, and I built that into its own component. Still writing all of this in script tags in my HTML. None of this needs to be compiled at this point, but I'm just using script tags as templates. And so I've got my navbar component, and that's nested inside my app like we see there. Nothing else has changed at this point. And going further, we'll just do the same thing with the post list. But really, when you get to this process, a lot of this is cut and paste. If any of you have worked with Elm, working with Elm's compiler, I kind of felt this was similar, that because things follow a consistent pattern, that refactoring tends to be really easy, that it's really just kind of moving data structures around. And so we've extracted a third component. It's our post component, but really nothing has changed here, except we've got an issue. So we were having our post trigger this upvote method, but that depends on this.post. And the post list has access to that data, but post does not. So what do we do about that? Well, what we can do about it is fire an event. So some of you may be familiar with this concept, but we can trigger an event in the child and pass up some data. The parent can catch that and do whatever it wants to do with it. The child doesn't really need to care about it, but that's probably the best candidate for the situation. So in the parent, we will listen for an upvote event, and that's what that @upvote equals handle upvote is. It's saying when you catch an event called upvote, run this function that we've defined down there in our methods. And so in the child, all we're going to do is this $emit. When you see those $sign methods, that means that that's something native to the Vue component. But we're just saying $emit allows us to emit an event, give it a name, and then pass in some value. In this case, we want to say, when you click the upvote button, fire this upvote event and give it an ID, and we don't care what happens from that point. The parent will handle it. So we can extend this concept of components a little further. We do need to get into Webpack and some build tooling for this, but we can get into those single file components. And as I kind of mentioned before, single file components are really nice because your HTML, your JavaScript, and your CSS specific to a component are all in one place. And that can seem really weird in the beginning, but when you get used to it, it's really nice, and I feel like it enabled me to be really productive. So this is what a single file component looks like. Basically, we have a template section, and that's going to be all of our HTML. So we don't need to specify a template anymore. It'll just be, if it's in a .vue file, it'll know that a template tag is the template for that component. We need to name it because that's going to specify what name we use when we add it to the DOM. And then we can also include our CSS right at the bottom. And if you notice that style language, we're specifying that we want to use Sass, and that scoped is saying that this styling is only for this component. If you do not include the scoped, it will trickle down to the children, but it won't go up to the parent and leak out. So at this point, I've got a couple minutes. I wanted to actually show you the finished app. Basically, you install the Vue CLI client, and then you view init a template, which is basically a community-provided set of boilerplate for a Vue application. So we're using the Webpack simple, and we're naming our app hnclone. So let's see if I can get this to work. We'll do yarn dev to start up the dev server. And then make that really big. And we'll see, we can upvote our posts. And they actually react to those changes. So this is kind of a trivial example, but I hope you can see that this was pretty simple to get started. And that's really what I wanted to share, that Vue was something I kind of peeked into. It took me about a day to figure this out, maybe more like a few hours, and I was able to be pretty productive. So I just wanted to encourage everybody, give Vue a try. Maybe you'll like it, maybe you won't. What I learned was kind of, maybe we need more tools like this that actually focus on that beginner experience, and they focus on really good onboarding, really good documentation, but also as things scale and the application scales, you're still able to be pretty productive. Just wanted to put that out there. Thank you again for allowing me to speak, and have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the conference.